So today we have Miss Celeste Scott, who's going to teach us about pruning. She's so awesome, and she has been an agent in Madison County since 2014. She is an ag and natural resource agent, such as myself, and she has the focus area in horticulture, and she is really good at just educating and advising the public on a wide range of horticulture topics, including vegetable gardening, ornamental plant selection, turf, plant ID, pest ID, and pest diagnostics. And again, today she's going to educate us on pruning. So thank you so much, Celeste, for joining on, and we're happy to have you.
So glad to be here. When Evangeline asked if there was a time in my schedule sometime in March or April when I could come talk with y'all, I was like, well, I'm sure we can figure something out, right? So we've got a lot of options if y'all are going at this every Wednesday of each week. So great opportunity for me to be here and share with a different audience. As they mentioned, I am the horticulture extension agent in Madison County. That's the area, Jackson, Tennessee. So I'm over here in the western region. So I don't always get to speak to groups over from the middle and eastern parts of the state. And so it's good to be here with you today. And so what we're going to talk about today is a little bit on pruning. I like to call this pruning demystified, right? Because I feel like there's almost a stigma around pruning. Like people feel like they're either doing it because they're supposed to be doing it, or they're not doing it because they don't know how to do it. So either way, hopefully we're going to clarify some of those things for you today. And we're going to talk about sometimes when pruning is warranted, times when it's not. We're going to talk about timing of pruning different types of plants. So I'm trying to squeeze a lot of information into one discussion. So we're going to focus on when to prune what, and then we're going to focus on how to prune. And I'm just going to give you some general basics. We're going to talk quite a bit about rules of thumb, which many of you know in the world of gardening, you can't ever say always, right? You can't just throw things into a category and say you're always going to do this. It's always dependent upon several factors. So we are going to talk about some general rules of thumb just to help get you going, and take away some of that skepticism and uncertainty that's usually associated with pruning. So let me get my screen shared with you. Okay, so here we go. So pruning demystified. And I'm also going to add, I've tried to include as many of my own photos as possible. So, I'm sure y'all are probably like me. Anytime I see a plant I really love, like sometimes I'll just pull over on the side of the road and say, oh my gosh, I love that. I love that. That's going to be a perfect picture to use in a program, and I'll just snap it. And so this one was actually taken a few miles down the road from my house last year. And I knew that they generally shear these forsythia almost every year, and they are never pretty. But last year they didn't, and look how gorgeous they were. So that is just a little teaser to get you excited about what is to come. And also forsythia is one of those early bloomers. So when I see it, starting to bloom in landscapes, it gets me excited for spring. And I just know that, better things are on the way. And I'm not progressing. Let me see. There we go. So considerations on when to prune. Well, there are some physiological considerations, like how far that plant is along in its development or its dormancy, how deep into dormancy it is. We can prune to control insects and disease in many cases. We may want to use pruning as a tool to shape a plant or control size, which is probably the number one reason, right, that most people want to prune. That bush is getting out over your sidewalk or into your areas where you'd rather not have them. Flowering and fruiting habits are the number one consideration that we need to be thinking about when we're deciding on when to prune these plants if they need size control. And then also, are these plants narrow-leaved or broadleaf evergreens, or are they deciduous? Because we're going to follow some different guidelines as far as how to prune those. So hopefully we'll be able to touch a little bit on each of these. So when I talked about dormancy, a dormant pruning is an excellent time to prune. The plant is not actively growing. It is spending all of its time strengthening its roots, and it is not putting, those juices aren't flowing yet to those leaf and flower buds. So the picture here you see on the left, that's an example of a swollen bud. So if you had a spring blooming plant and the flower buds were already fat and swollen, like we see here, you probably don't want to prune that part of the plant off because that is what is going to deliver you your blooms. However, the picture here on the right, this is a dormant bud. You can tell it was developed last year on old wood, but it hasn't swollen with the juices, if you will, of the springtime. So we're looking towards dormant pruning for the majority of plants. That's a rule of thumb. Insect and disease control. Oh, I love pruning out disease canes on my roses. I'm just telling y'all, I love roses. I'm one of the few people that still try to grow hybrid tea roses. I mean, it's a losing battle, but I just can't give it up. And they are going to get cane blights and leaf blights. And in some cases, the best course of action is just to prune those diseased canes out. Here, the picture on the right, this is actually a cluster of buds that has an infestation of scale on it. They're a little bit, you can't really see them, but I decided to throw that picture in as well. So if you have a concentrated area of infestation, you can oftentimes control that through pruning and prevent having to use chemicals later in the season. So now let's move on and talk about when to prune what. So let's think about plants that are prized for their fruit display. So these are going to follow a bit of a different rule of thumb than plants that we prize for their bloom display. So let's take, for example, the picture down here in the center here. This is a fruit cluster from a viburnum. Now, some viburnums have very showy, pretty blooms in late spring. Some are considered early summer, and some are almost insignificant, and are actually, some are prized more for their fruit display that comes on in late summer or early fall. So if this is a plant that we are cherishing for its fall fruit display, even though it blooms in the spring, we wouldn't want to prune it immediately after flowering, which you're going to find is a rule of thumb. Because if you did that, you're cutting off your blooms that would have then developed into the berries, okay? So what we're wanting to do with these is just put off any pruning until they develop their fruit, let them maintain their fruit display, and when they are either overpicked by birds or wildlife, or they begin to lose their luster, as many of them have. I have some winterberry hollies that were gorgeous about 2 months ago, but now are kind of looking like they're just barely hanging on, right? Those berries have started to shrivel. Many of them have fallen. Many of them have been eaten. And so that is the time when you would want to initiate any type of pruning on these berry possessing plants. So there on the right, that's an Andina domestica. I know a lot of people don't like those, but I do enjoy their red clusters of berries and use those in winter displays quite often. I believe that picture on the left was a pyracantha that had been espalade. I think that's how you say it. French term, not super good with the accents. And that picture was taken down in the Memphis area. So that's a really pretty plant. I will say it does have thorns, so be careful with that. Threw in some pictures of some really gorgeous hollies here. We're all familiar with hollies and how they put on red bloom displays. And here in West Tennessee, most of our hollies are still hanging on to their fruit displays pretty well, especially the red hybrid hollies, which is what we're looking at here. And then we have deciduous hollies. Or winterberry hollies. This one in particular is called Red Sprite. This picture was taken, wasn't at the research center. I can't remember where I took this picture, but this is Red Sprite. And always keep in the back of your mind that these winterberry hollies need a pollinator. They need a male pollinator. The plants are male or female. So if you get, say, Red Sprite is our female, there's a bunch of different cultivars that do well in this area. But then we have some universal male pollinator plants. So Southern Gentleman is one that we recommend, quite often. That would be considered a universal pollinator for these females. If you're planting these in groupings, which really creates the most impact, the most visual impact, if you have a large enough area, you want to plant several females, and then you need to stick your male in there, but try not to put it in the front, because remember, it won't have berries. It's there to ensure that the female flowers get pollinated, and then later in the season produce their berry display. So go ahead and put that male in the back. If you're like me, I feel like I need one of everything. So I don't have room to have a nice big display of these berry producing plants, but I do have one. And so I hid the male kind of back behind some hydrangeas where you can't really see them very much. Because it's not a particularly attractive plant during the growing season. It's just a bush with green leaves. So things to keep in mind. All right, this plant is, I feel like, underutilized probably in our landscapes. And this picture was taken at the West Tennessee Research and Education Center here in Jackson. This is a cotoneaster, and it also has a beautiful orangey red, fruit display that is actually put on a little later than most of our other fruit-bearing plants. So the berries of these are still hanging on right now in the garden, and it's evergreen as well. So moving on from talking about plants that we prize for their fruit displays, and remember, we're going to prune them after their fruit display begins to wane, okay? Whatever time of year that may be, that's when you need to do it, okay? When we're talking about spring flowering plants, and that's why I feel like this talk is so important to give right now, we want to wait and prune them until after their bloom display. I know so many people, the weather gets warm. Today is a beautiful day. Hopefully we'll get to go outside for a few minutes here at the end. It's sunny, it's warm, and folks want to get out there and chop stuff down. I found that it's common, right? So I just don't want people to get too antsy with all of these pruning regimens. Don't get out there and chop your forsythias back right now. You're going to lose your bloom display. They're fixing to bloom in a few weeks, probably, if the temperatures stay up as they are right now. Azaleas are another shrub that I so often see butchered, and we really wish that we could take our hands off of those and let them have their natural growth habit and their natural bloom before we do any type of pruning to those. Because I don't know if y'all ever seen like azaleas that have gotten so big that they're pruned into like hedges essentially, which is fine, but just don't do it in the fall. Don't do it in late winter. Wait until they bloom, then come in and do that pruning immediately after its peak bloom display. That's what we're aiming for. Pruning after peak bloom display. And I've got a couple examples. We've got quince, those are early bloomers, signal the coming of spring. Kira japonica down here on the right, or yellow rose of Texas, some call it. The picture here on the left is actually a viburnum. This is an arrowleaf viburnum. And then we have our beloved snowball bush, which is also a viburnum. I get lots of calls on these in the springtime. People asking me how to prune their white hydrangeas. And bless their hearts, because I know it does kind of look like a hydrangea, but it's not. It's a viburnum. And so we need to make sure that we know what type of plant we're dealing with before we jump in and start to prune. So all of these, remember, we're pruning immediately after their peak bloom display. Weigelia is another that I love. I know some people, this may be the bane of their existence. It's kind of wild and woolly and just grows wherever it, contorted limbs, and has a really strange form to it, but the blooms are gorgeous, and they have reblooming varieties on the market. This particular one is in my garden. It's called Wine and Roses, and the pictures just cannot do it justice. I'm telling y'all, the vibrancy of this deep, deep hot pink is So stunning. And it puts on its main bloom display in early spring, and then it comes back again later in summer and will have a much lighter bloom display, but it does put on, sporadically through the summer. So since this is an early, well, we'll say a spring blooming plant, if I went out there and began to chop on it today, I would be cutting off a lot of the flowering wood that was produced last season by this plant, okay? So these plants bloom on what we call, I think this is the first time I've said the term today, old wood. When I say old wood, I mean wood that was grown in the previous growing season, okay? Another that blooms on old wood, lilacs. I wish that bigger picture in the background was brighter so you could really see the brilliance of this plant. But this is a Miss Kim lilac, and it has an intoxicating fragrance. And as many of you may know, they may do better in East Tennessee than they do here, but by the end of summer, this plant's leaves are badly scorched. The margins, the edges of them have turned black. It begins to defoliate, and it has lost all of its leaves by probably the end of August. And that worried me for the first several years, but I just let it do its thing. It comes back every spring, healthy, vibrant. It has loads of blooms on it, and it just cannot handle that heat and humidity. So when we get further east, if your elevations are higher and we have a little reprieve from some of that humidity, I'm sure these look better for a longer period of time in the garden. But lilacs, again, prune after their peak bloom display. I already mentioned azaleas. I just had to throw these pictures in there. I have some master gardeners here, the Bobbitts and David and Carol Sams, and they have beautiful shade gardens. And these were some photos that I took of their azaleas last year, and I just wanted to show those off. A few others. Spirea. Bridalveil spirea. Oh my goodness, look how beautiful it is. They're on the top left. I have never had one of my own that was this floriferous. If you have, I need a cutting of it, but they certainly are beautiful. I took a cutting from one that was in my great grandmother's garden, and it does satisfy my need for those cascades of white blooms, but so pretty. Do not prune them now. Wait until after their peak bloom. Another here on the bottom right that more people may have in their residential landscapes is Ogon spirea. This is one of those plants that we prize for year-round interest. It has beautiful blooms on it in early spring, just covers it, looks like a snow mound. Then the new foliage comes out and is kind of like neon-y green, chartreuse type. And then when we get into the fall, that foliage begins to turn kind of a butterscotch golden color. And sometimes it actually holds its foliage longer than I would want it to, and starts to like clash with my Christmas decorations. But it will eventually lose its leaves and then bear those blooms the following spring, once again on bare stems. So let's wait. If it starts to get kind of wild and like too thick and has a lot of dead on the inside of that canopy, we can prune these, but we need to wait until after they do their bloom, or we'll sacrifice the beauty of that early spring bloom display. I have to touch on hydrangeas. I feel like I cannot have a talk without talking a little bit about hydrangeas. So macrophylla hydrangeas, or our mop head hydrangeas, the ones that are typically colored, blue, purples, yellows, these bloom predominantly on old wood, especially the older cultivars. So if you're having issues with your hydrangeas not blooming, try laying off the pruning for a year. You may just be chopping off your old wood every year, and that could very well be the issue. So, but I'm going to throw in there are remontant types of hydrangeas that can bloom on new wood. And for example, this is an endless summer, this picture here on the right. These are at our county extension office. Let me think, not last summer. So let me go, December, not this past December, but the December before that. That's confusing. December of 2019. Is that right? December of, what's this year? We're in 2021. So December of 2019, the county maintenance people came in and chopped all these canes off to the ground. I'm talking they only left like 2 or 3 inches. And I was like, I was upset at first, but then I said, well, this could turn into a pretty good, experiment, right? So let's see just how well they regenerate themselves. So they were cut off at the base at the inappropriate time. All the old wood was cut off. So the following spring, if you're going by our rules of thumb, you would assume that this plant would not bloom the following year. And guess what? It didn't bloom the following spring when all of the other macrophylla hydrangeas were blooming. It was spending all of its energy growing new canes. However, since this is a remontant variety, by the end of the summer, those new canes had actually put on bloom buds. And this picture right here was taken last year in the beginning of October. So I had blooms in September and October instead of early spring when most people have macrophyllas blooming. So that is just an example to show you, don't be afraid. If you prune at the inappropriate time, it's not the end of the world. These plants will come back. Even if this wasn't a remontant variety, guess what? It would have had blooms this coming spring. So you can't mess anything up, but I'm just trying to teach you some best management practices on timing. Another hydrangea that falls into the same category is oak leaf hydrangea. So they are considered spring bloomers because that is when they initiate their bloom. And I know that can get confusing because we typically leave the blooms of oak leaves on the plant all season just for visual interest. They dry well on the plant and they can be very beautiful on into the fall and winter in some cases. So the only instance where I would prune one of these is if it was outgrowing its space. I prefer the natural growth habit of oak leaves. They kind of have a mounding, they're not a perfect mound. You may have like a taller clump over here and then, a lower clump over in this area. It's just very natural feeling to me. And I prefer that shape. So with that being said, let me throw another turn at you. Camellias. We have fall blooming camellias and winter blooming camellias. So if you have, I put them in this category because I want you to prune them after their main floral display. So if it's a fall bloomer, you prune it in late winter because that is after its peak bloom display, right? If it's a winter bloomer, you still prune it immediately after its fall bloom display in late winter. Does that make sense? Okay. I just don't want you pruning them before they bloom. Okay. So just hold off. Now, and that is kind of against the rule of thumb because it blooms at the different time. It doesn't bloom in early spring, right? But I put them in this category because I want you to hold off. All right. So now we'll move on and talk a little bit about some summer flowering plants. These summer flowering plants, we want to prune in late winter. When I say late winter, it really depends on where you live in the state of Tennessee. So for me, that's February through March. I've already started doing some pruning, some light pruning. If I have any type of really heavy duty, regenerative type of pruning, I might wait a little later until like the end of March on into April, just to kind of bypass that potential of having any really severe late winter weather. Like we had this ice/snow thing that happened last week. You can't even tell now because it's all melted and beautiful outside. But we certainly were grateful for that. We don't get to see snow very often, so that was fun. Anywho, side note, back to summer flowering plants. Spireas, crepe myrtles, rose of Sharon. So just think about all of these plants that provide us beauty and with their blooms in the summertime. These are the plants that we should be looking to right now to prune. And why, you may ask, is because they bloom on new wood. It's okay if we prune off the wood that they grew last year. It's okay, because their buds are going to be set on wood that they generate from the time they come out of dormancy up until their bloom period. I hope that makes sense. I threw in a bunch of different pictures. We've got Itea, Abelia falls into this category, lots of different Abelias in the landscape. We've got Edward Goucher that's very compact and small. We've got some grandiflora or glossy Abelia that can get very tall, 5 or 6 feet, and have these weeping canes for branches with really beautiful clusters of blooms. So a lot to offer there in the world of Abelias. We have some natives like Bottlebrush, Buckeye, and Beautyberry here on the right. I think this is actually not our native blue Beautyberry. That's seems to be a picture of a Japanese beautyberry, but we'll talk about the American beautyberry here in a little bit. And I think this picture up here at the top is Clethra, which is also a native. So lots of interest going on in the garden. All these plants should be pruned about now, late winter. Okay, another hydrangea. We've got to talk about the hydrangeas again. The paniculata hydrangeas or sun-loving hydrangeas fall into the category of pruning in late winter. And again, that is because its blooms, the bloom buds are generated on new wood. We don't have to worry about the wood that it grew last year. So technically, you could cut these down to the ground each year and still get blooms. However, you're going to be restricting the size of your plant. So if you want a large plant, you need to leave that scaffold branching that it grew last year so that it can put on even more growth and then have the blooms along the outer canopy of that larger plant. I hope that makes sense. Another thing that you can do with pruning as far as the paniculatas go, if you prune them, say pinch them back almost, say 6 to 10 inches all the way around on all the branches, you may actually be increasing the size. I want to make sure I say this the right way so I don't confuse anyone. If you don't prune them, you'll have bigger blooms. If you do prune them, you'll have more blooms, but maybe not quite as large. Does that make sense? Okay, but it'll be covered more heavily with blooms. Okay, so good things to keep in mind. The final hydrangea I'm going to talk to you today about is the arborescens, or the smooth hydrangea, or the Annabelle hydrangea, which I know a lot of people have passed along in their gardens. I have one that came from my aunt across the street, and they are glorious. And if you have them in your garden, you know that they clump and they spread, and so they're easy to share with friends. And this also is a hydrangea that blooms on new wood. So when we get into like the fall and winter, the leftover canes of these smooth hydrangea are kind of twiggy, and they just aren't as appealing as some of, say, our oak leaf hydrangeas or paniculata hydrangeas would be. I like to leave, a lot of that scaffolding just for winter interest. But the Annabelles, they're the shortest hydrangea. They only get 3 or 4 feet tall, and they just look twiggy and trashy. And so it's completely fine if you want to come in and clean those out from year to year. But occasionally I do like to leave some of the larger, older stems just to create some support for the new growth that comes up through there. So all good tips for timely pruning. Now, when we get into evergreens, it can get a bit tricky because we need to consider if this particular plant has latent or sleeping buds within its old wood. If you prune into that old wood and there are no latent buds or very few latent buds, you are less likely to get regenerative growth. So, for all evergreens, we want to aim towards dormant pruning in late winter, which is now, right? I know most people think that they want to prune in the fall for some reason, but let me tell you what that does, especially in West Tennessee with the warmer, crazy fluctuations of weather that we have. We'll have a landscape company come in and prune all the boxwoods in October. But then we don't get early October, but then we don't get a frost until Halloween. And by then, the boxwoods have put on fresh new growth, maybe an inch or two of new growth. And as soon as the frost comes, all that new growth that grew since the last pruning withers, falls over and withers, turns like that ugly tan color. And then you have really unattractive boxwoods for the duration of winter. So let's hold off until our plants go dormant, our evergreens, hold off until they go dormant and try to focus any type of pruning on those, especially for size control towards late winter. So we'll go back to the topic of latent buds. If we have conifers, essentially, I put narrow leaf evergreens on there, but what I meant was conifers. We do not want to prune into old wood. Have you ever gone out into an arborvitae, opened it up, and seen bare stems on the inside? Well, that's because evergreens don't keep the same leaves forever, right? They drop those inside leaves and put on new leaves on the most outer parts of that plant. And so as long as the plant is growing, the inside of that plant is going to become more and more bare. So if you delayed pruning and you let, say you had an arborvitae and you let it outgrow its space because you weren't paying any attention to it, you weren't doing any tip pruning or anything like that, and you say, I really need this columnar arborvitae to be about half of its size. If you come in and shear all that off and all you have left are twigs, that plant does not have enough latent buds to regenerate its entire self. And so that is not going to work out for you. However, you can do pruning on evergreens, right? We can control size. We can do tip pruning, where you're just taking off, the outside tips, but not going back into that old wood. And Jason Reeves, the curator of the UT Gardens here in Jackson at the West Tennessee Research and Education Center, he and I do a Facebook Live every Tuesday morning at 9. And yesterday we did demos on pruning conifers specifically. In the coming weeks, we'll do another one that focuses on pruning broadleaf evergreens. So if you want a little more guidance on how to, kind of approach that, just go to the UT Gardens Jackson Facebook page, and we post all of our Facebook Lives there. So you can go back and watch that one. Now, for the case of some broadleaf evergreens, say like boxwoods and hollies, viburnums, some that we have already mentioned today, I'm trying to think of others, curvy leaf ligustrums, and just any other kind of broadleaf evergreen you can think of. It is for the most part, it's okay to prune them into their old wood. If you have a boxwood that's outgrown its space, you can prune into that that old wood, and it should stimulate those latent buds to come awake. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to refill its form in a year or even 2 years, but it will, regenerate, and you can do some size control with that. All right, now I have some here. I'm going to stop. I think I'm going to stop sharing and try to take y'all outside and just show you a quick demo on some different types of pruning. Actually, here, let me show you all this real quick before we go out there. So how does pruning work? So look at this picture here on the right, and can you see my little arrow swirling around, Evangeline? Can you see? Okay.
You're a mouse.
Okay, good. So this is your terminal bud. And on the terminal ends of limbs, there is a hormone there called auxin. And auxin prevents the growth of lateral buds that are beneath that terminal bud. So if we remove that auxin, we then allow these lateral buds to grow, essentially. So even though we are, in some cases, pruning to control growth or reduce size, keep in mind that when you make a pruning cut, what you have actually done is induced growth. So we want to make sure that we're inducing growth to the proper areas of our plant. And so, for example, we can control where that growth happens. Look at this diagram here and imagine, just for simplicity's sake, imagine that it's a hybrid tea rose. We want hybrid teas to be similar to this picture here on the left, right? We want to increase airflow. We want to increase light, circulation. And so we want the branches to grow in an outward fashion. We don't want them growing inside on top of each other. So every time we make a cut, a pruning cut, we're going to select an area on that cane that has a terminal bud facing the outside of that plant. Can you see that? We made a cut here. The bud is on the left. On the right side of the plant, we made a cut here. The bud was on the right. And following those same rules, if you had a plant that you were trying to maintain into a more columnar fashion, like creating a formal column, if you will, for like an entrance or something like that, you could do the exact opposite, and you could select all your pruning points to influence growth towards the inside of that plant. So I threw in a couple of pictures. I don't have many evergreens here in my garden, so I did want to show you a few examples of some pruning cuts that I made last year to a few boxwoods. And I was not hedge shearing, which boxwoods are. I mean, you can totally shear them if that's what you want to do, but I prefer a more natural look growth habit to these boxwoods. And I had some crazy growth up here at the top. And so when I made that pruning cut, you don't cut right here on the surface of this globe, if you will. If you did that, I would have had this amount of regrowth within a matter of months. So instead of coming and shearing that off right at the surface, I went down into the canopy and made a cut here that was then hidden by the surrounding limbs that I left. And so then what you end up with is a very natural looking plant. This is the same example I just wanted to show you with the holly. Leaves on hollies are opposite of one another. Mm-hmm. So when you make a cut, you have not only stimulated one terminal bud, but two, because they're both right there. And this was an example. We have this growth. It was sticking up above the plant, kind of like, ET antennas, because the county folks had come in and sheared these hollies the year before. So I had a lot of this forked growth on the top. So the picture here on the right, I went down into the canopy. I tried to get a good picture, but it was hard. And tried to take a picture of where I made that cut. I went way down into the inside of that shrub. And what we ended up with, this is what the holly looked like when we started. And this is what it looked like on the right when we got done with it. So thinning cuts, this is what I'm going to take y'all and show you outside. When you have cane type shrubs, those are shrubs that are putting up growth like directly from the ground, essentially, new canes every year. When you have these types of plants, it's really tempting to just come in and shear them off at like 1 or 2 foot high. But oftentimes what you end up with is growth like this here on the bottom. You stimulate a lot of growth at the top where you made those cuts and potentially shade out anything that's going on underneath, and then have a funny shaped shrub. So we could do one of two things. You could do a regenerative pruning and cut it all the way off at the base, and then you get all new fresh growth. You're basically starting from new. Or you could come in and use the rule of thirds to do some thinning cuts, like this picture shows here on the top. What we've done here is we've removed a third of the old growth. Then the next third we prune to about half of its size, and the other third we leave. And so that gives us, we have new growth at every stage, and results in a really nicely shaped, natural type growth habit. Plants that would be considered, cane type, there's lots of them. Let's think like abelias, spireas, beautyberries, sweet shrubs. Oh Lord, the list goes on and on. But so if it's okay with you, Evangeline, we're at 11:45. Could I try to join from my phone and take y'all outside and just show you a quick demo on how to do this thirds rule?
Okay. So we are outside at my house. It's kind of windy, so I'm sorry if that messes up with our audio, but I do want to introduce y'all to a few tools real quickly. So of course you got to have a good pair of hand shears, hand cutters right here. Take better care of yours than I do mine. Look how rusty they are. If you have, my garden is so young that I don't have any plants that really require the use of this handsaw, but if you have larger plants, that might come in handy. For the most part, I just like to use my loppers. And I will tell you that when you go to select some loppers, make sure that you get what they call a bypass lopper. So not an anvil type lopper. An anvil type lopper, the blade on top hits directly on this, the hook or the bottom of the bill, I guess what you would call it. It hits flat right on there, and it creates more of like a crushing action. What you want is a bypass pruner like these. Can you see how the black blade goes right past that bottom silver part? And so that's what we're looking for, and that's going to give you really good clean cuts. Let's see where to go. So I do want to show y'all an example of those buds, how we were talking about opposite buds. This is a viburnum. I think it's Acer, maple leaf viburnum. And you can see here where we've got opposite buds developing. So if I made a cut immediately above that, I would encourage growth of both of these lateral buds. However, if you were trying to control the direction of growth and you didn't want that to happen, you could just come in here and pull one of those buds off, okay? So now that one's gone, and now you're increasing your growth towards the outside of your plant right here. So what we're looking at right here is an American beautyberry, and this plant typically gets crepe myrtle bark scale because it's right beside a crepe myrtle that I allow to have crepe myrtle bark scale so that I can use it for demonstration purposes. And crepe myrtle bark scale is known to, it has started using American beautyberry as an alternative host. So generally, I cut this down to the ground every year. And I just prefer that because the space that it's in is not huge. And if I allowed it to just grow and grow and grow and grow, it could really, really outgrow this space. However, since it is a cane type shrub, I thought that this would be the perfect way to show you how to apply the rule of thirds. And then just so that you know, after we get done, I'm going to chop it all the way down. So I've been saving this just for y'all. So remember what I said. The first step that we do is we take a third of the total growth of this plant out. So I pick the oldest canes Those are going to be the largest ones that are, have the thickest diameter. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay, so I feel like I've taken out about a third of the main growth of this beautyberry. So the next step is to come in and remove on another third of the limbs, remove about half of their growth. Okay. Okay, so I've finished that second step. So in the ideal world, you would be done. But in this particular case, I really want to bring this in a little more, make sure that it has a little tighter growth habit. So you could come in and tip the remaining third of those branches. Just take off, 6 to 10 inches at the tips. All right. And what we're left with is a prune beautyberry that is about 1/3 of the size that it was when we started. And remember, I said these cane type shrubs can also tolerate shearing to the ground, cutting down to the ground each year. And you're going to get nice, new, fresh growth every year.
That was so much, Celeste. That was great.
Thank you. Here's another one that needs, I probably could have shown y'all. This is going to be a quince bush, one of those thornless quince bushes, but I don't want to prune it because why, everybody? Because it's fixing to bloom. So this is one that we'll wait on. I'll wait to do pruning on it. Also, it has a mimosa tree growing out of it, so I don't know what I'm going to do about that.
Okay, I'm back. So y'all just shoot them to me.
If a plant has 2 blooming times, spring and late summer, do you wait till after the summer to summer bloom to prune?
That is an excellent question. And the answer is no. You prune after its main bloom. So even reblooming plants like, say, Weigelia or those remontant hydrangeas, their main bloom season is spring. So that if you need to do any pruning, it should be done after the first bloom display. So you may actually be sacrificing some of that remontant bloom, but that's the way of it. Now is the best time to do pruning for blueberries. You want to do it in the dormant season, okay? So you will be pruning off a large amount of fruiting wood, but in blueberry cases, especially if you're a production, you're growing blueberries for production, and that's okay because that improves the remaining crop that is left on your plant and allows it to become bigger and do better. So blueberries should be pruned during the dormant season, which is right about now.
Awesome. And this may be a little more intricate of an answer to get into, but it says the question is, when and how would you prune a crepe myrtle?
Oh, yes. So I'm glad you asked that. Can I share my screen one more time? Rejuvenation pruning. Oh, let me talk about that real quick. If you have something that's just huge and you need it not to be huge anymore, like I saw a viburnum yesterday at a client's house that had 4 main stems that were probably like 3 inches in diameter, and it was just out of control. You can rejuvenation prune, and essentially that means you come in, chop those off, and hope that those latent buds down here in the old wood wake up. Okay, so now this is a picture of crepe myrtles. So my preferred method of crepe myrtle pruning, and I know this is not possible or feasible in every situation because some of them are like 30 and 40 feet tall. But if we have, 15, 25 foot tall crepe myrtles that we can prune ourselves with ladders and pruning equipment, this is the way that I would go. First, you remove any dead limbs. Next, you look for limbs that are crossing or rubbing. Next, I go to twiggy limbs. So what we're trying to do with a crepe myrtle is establish main scaffold limbs. That's really what attracts our eye. We don't want all these twiggy things. So you can see all the twigginess coming off on the right side of this picture right here. Now, the picture on the left is what it looked like when I started, which wasn't that bad, right? I mean, most people would be probably happy with that the way it was. However, once I pruned dead, crossing, rubbing, and twigginess off, this is the scaffold branching that I was left with here on the right. And so while I can't give you a precise formula on how to do this, it just takes a lot of snipping and then standing back, snipping and then standing back, and just deciding on, if I wanted the canopy of this crepe myrtle to be higher, I need to eliminate some of these lower scaffold branches. So it just depends on your particular situation and how you want it to look when you get done.
Somebody just asked about when should you prune Japanese maples?
And during the dormant season. So now would be, now through March, early April would be a good time to prune them. But again, you don't want to do too much cutting on a Japanese maple because you will, you'll ruin that natural contorted growth habit that a lot of them have. But if you're limbing up, if you have a larger species or cultivar that needs to be limbed up or something like that, now would be the time. I think I caught one about butterfly bushes, and I'll say that, yes, butterfly bushes are considered a summer bloomer, so dormant season pruning is ideal. But again, unless you have some of the older cultivars of butterfly bushes are hardier. Some of these newer ones that they've come out with, I've not had much success with their previous year's growth surviving. So be careful if it's a new installation. Don't do a lot of pruning on it because you might need that.
Do you know how to prune new whips? I know that's kind of in-depth, not in-depth, but we're kind of running short on time.
Yeah, new whips and young trees get a little trickier, but we do have a good pruning guide.
Pulled up best management practices for pruning landscape trees, shrubs.
That's it.
That's it.
Yeah, that's it. How do you prune a lantana? But if you are in an area where its survival is marginal, as far as it being a perennial, then I would say leave all the above ground, limbs, leave all those limbs throughout the winter. Come in and I'm going to go and say even April, I would really wait. You really want to wait until, we've missed any threats of hard weather, prune those off to the ground. And then you will have all fresh growth, and lantanas come out super, super late. So many people, they'll call me saying, my perennial lantana is not coming back this year. And I say, oh, it's coming. It just hasn't made its arrival yet. So it's one of the latest perennials to resprout and bloom out. And I can't imagine leaving any of my old wood because the thing gets massive, right? Like Miss Huff and Ham and Eggs. The ones I have here are like taller than me and just take over. They're like beasts.
Thank you very much, Celeste, for coming in from Jackson. And
Yeah, you're welcome.
always look over there for all the great things that you're doing over there at the research station.
Well, thank you so much, Celeste. Everyone seems to really be loving it in the comment section, and I'm sure we're all inspired to prune properly.
Good. Sounds good.
All right. Bye, guys.
Thank you very much.